Hello and welcome to Cybeats Powerhouse Perspectives, episode number 38. And with me today is the great Eliot Lear. How the hell are you doing, Eliot?
I'm doing great, Chris. It's great to be here, and thanks for inviting me.
And where are you in the world? I should know
I
this.
am in the little town of Wetzikon, Switzerland, which is just outside of Zurich. We had our first snow today, in fact.
Yay. And here in Central Florida, we in fact did. We also don't have hand roll underwear, made locally and so forth. So for everybody who's not in Switzerland, best underwear in the world. So
So I'm
you and I, so, yeah, it was. I've only been to Switzerland once or twice. It was way back in my Cisco days, and it'll sort of lead to where we're going to begin this conversation. The late '90s, early 2000s. I was Cisco as a firewall guy and going all over the place. And I got to Switzerland and ran short of laundry and discovered hand row. And it's one of those things that sticks with me forever. And it's everything's analogy for everything else, right? This how do we get information sharing, right? How would you even be aware that those exist? So much of what we have is random. And in the looking back, Anthony, if you want to roll that first question, right, looking back at the firewall world, right? I look at my career through this, it was like firewalls and then SIM and then threat intelligence and supply chain and all these other steps along the way, right? And I always managed to know just enough. Like we're talking about before we start rolling here, right? We don't, you and I clearly, to be clear to anybody, don't know all there is to know about software supply chain security. We're figuring a lot of it out. We may know more than some folks do today, and in 5 and 10 years, everybody's going to know that, and we'll still be figuring out something else, right? But back in the firewall days, the '90s, when I was at Cisco, I actually, worked a fair bit to not support security management, right? Because the idea back then, so it was Checkpoint, late '90s, right? Checkpoint versus everyone else, right? And Checkpoint had VPN1, had the management platform. And everybody, in fact, a little bit of interesting trivia. In '98, the Cisco executive team, John Chambers, end of life picks. It was supposed to fly into the ground because everybody knew the Checkpoint was going to win because they had management. I didn't believe anyone was managing anything in the late '90s. You're buying a firewall, maybe configuring it, probably deploying it, never looking at it again. But then we get to 2002 when SIM starts to come up, right? And then threat intelligence and supply chain. We have all these interconnected webs, right? So how bad was visibility back in your early days? What were your thoughts and threads and progress to where you spend all your time talking supply chain transparency these days?
So I think about an incident that happened. Gosh, this had to be around 1991 or 1992, maybe just a little bit later, in which at the time the connectivity to Australia was going through NASA, and it was also the introduction, believe it or not, of the internet to piracy, where a lot of software would be pirated, and there was one academic institution in America where one of the professors felt that they had to offer free access to anybody who wanted it, and he became essentially the first version of Pirate Bay, if you will. And so, of course, the protocols back then, this was before HTTP, so the protocol was FTP, and the NASA administrator, not the system administrator, the network administrator, not the
right.
The guy at the top, had said, well, I can't have all this piracy flowing through my link, so I'll create an access list. And gee, aren't I smart? I can shut down piracy, not to mention, pornographic images and all sorts of other things, to Australia. And an entire protocol suite was developed in answer to this, called FSP, which was essentially a spread spectrum version, and things kept on. It used UDP to distribute communications such that you couldn't tell that, you couldn't see the traffic if you were just looking at TCP ports. And additional hosts were used as well. So they hid the traffic, and this person blindly believed that he had solved the problem. Well, every time we think we've solved the visibility problem, somebody comes up with a new way to stay invisible, whether that's onion routing or DNS over HTTP. There's always going to be some way to hide one's footprints, and perhaps that's a good thing from a privacy perspective, by the way. But it does pose some challenges to security administrators, and privacy of IoT devices is a subject unto its own.
Right. There's so many bloody layers, and you had me thinking. In the early firewall days, so borderware was my thing. The TIS, gauntlet was out there. Pix. It's funny. I was at TIS, and Fred Avolio wrote a paper that was fairly popular. Basically, not naming names, it was kind of saying why Checkpoint and Pix sucked, because you didn't have application level proxy filters where proxies where you can break down, and to our point here, have visibility into every single thing that's going on at the protocol level for every single connection. And then I took the job at Cisco. Now I was the Pix guy, and it's like, oh, we're not doing that. It's like, well, look, the traffic flows and we're getting into high volumes of stuff. It was, to your point about Australia, that didn't work. That was with probably a T1 line, connecting an entire continent, and the access control implementation didn't work.
Yeah,
but
I'll just add there, Chris. Right, every time we aim for application level visibility, right, there's a price to be paid, because instead of having a two-party or even a one-party system, right, you end up in at least a third party inserting themselves, and that information can be misinterpreted by that third party, which, by the way, in the case of the Cisco Pix, there was an infamous bug in which the Pix claimed to implement extended SMTP, but actually didn't, and mail broke in hilarious ways because of it. Obviously, they fixed it, but when you have application layer firewalls that are not specified in the architecture, things get a little weird.
Well, and it gets into the, one of my favorite little markers in time is Xanadu. The blanking on his name right now. But that was, in the 1800s, you could have read everything published in Samuel Coleridge, wrote that, and he was, famed to have read everything published in the English language. And if you lived a long time and had the opportunity and were, a fast reader, you could keep up. And since then, you can't. Right. And I think the defining characteristic of our era, writ large, and what we're talking about here in the smaller part of cybersecurity over a couple of decades, is, if you desire to really force it into a box, you can't get there. There's too much information, and so all these threads that I follow in firewalls and in SIM, I should see what's going on my network. Ooh, let's take that information, put it together. A lot of information. How do you use that? OT monitoring, has come along, and all these companies are now in that space. We can see what's going there. Threat intelligence. Let's create IOCs. Let's share those. Let's see what's going on, compare things to everything else. And now supply chain. And I guess there's sort of, a couple of questions in people's minds. Is there always going to be another thing, in this situational awareness pipeline? Are we starting to get into structures, leading directly into this next question, Anthony, if you want to roll that one? Do you think we're starting to get into structures where we'll be able to get more persistent, usable situational awareness? Like MUD.
Right. So for those who don't know, MUD stands for Manufacturer Usage Descriptions, and its purpose in life is to provide a framework by which end devices, particularly IoT devices, describe what they are and what access they need, and maybe how they're composed, even in terms of software. So where to go find a software bills of material, where to go find a VEX statement or vulnerability information about that device, maybe where to go find certification information. And this sort of information is needed at the enterprise level to provide the situational awareness that you mentioned, Chris. We need ways to scale, and the network trying to guess all this, we have some success. I work at Cisco. It's our job to try and figure this stuff out, but it will always be better if the endpoints and their manufacturers can tell us a little bit more about those devices and how they're supposed to be behaving on the network. And that way, we know if the device is acting anomalously or not. And moreover, we can say, this thermostat has no business talking to YouTube, for instance. Let's shut that behavior down. And there's similar examples in the consumer space. The service providers, it's interesting. NIST has said, actually, it's probably a good idea for manufacturers to produce these MUD files and for service providers to consume them. And that's true because consumers aren't going to know what needs to happen on their network in order to protect them, right? My dad doesn't know. He might need to know what's on his network, but he doesn't need to know anything about, what sort of access a device needs or its posture. He needs an agent to act on his behalf. So a service provider could be that agent. And that provides visibility in a way that protects not only consumers, but everybody else, because consumer devices are where a lot of these attacks come from.
Right. And this is, of course, where you and I are living our daily professional lives these days, right? And, we're talking just before we went live, but not having the answers, right? And we really don't, and to illustrate that, I'm sitting here today, yesterday, the last 3 days, I've started to write my slides for S4, it's the middle of February. And it's the day in the life of an SBOM. And I think I've got a frame for it now, but I want to talk to you about that because I need to dig a little bit further to be able to say, all right, an open source developer makes a library. A vendor takes that library and uses it internally, CI/CD pipeline, Jenkins, and all sorts of wonderful things. Does creates a lot of information, SBOMs and in Toto and whatnot. And an integrator takes that product, builds a solution. An asset owner takes that solution, deploys it, and a vulnerability is discovered in the library. And that's one layer of things, but I really want to focus on the IOCs. I think you touched on this in one of your comments, right? But a million vulnerabilities out there. Some of the working groups, our friends and our peers we talk about the thousands of insulin pumps they have in their hospital infrastructure. Vulnerabilities are great. However, an indicator of compromise is a different thing. Nation state actor A is attacking facilities like this with these sort of vulnerabilities by these sort of vendors. That's information that can be used. And I want to, in this talk, walk through how this all fits together, right? The open source developer didn't make an SBOM. The vendor made lots. The integrator required certain things, VEX and SBOM and whatnot. The asset owner required certain things. If there is IOC about system you sold me, you will thus and such do these things. And right down to exactly what you said, you'll take care of it for me. I'm a small water facility. I'm not going to do anything. I want you up front to say that you're going to have an SBOMs from your suppliers. You're going to get a VEX if there's an IOC that affects me. Within 24 hours, you're going to tell me what you've already done so that I don't have to worry about this.
Right. And this goes along a number of trends, right? Trend number one is that IT people, the cost of them has skyrocketed, right? We're a precious commodity. And so we need scaling factors. Right? The great Mike Odell said the only problem you ever have to worry about on the internet is scale. And I'm sure he knew what he was saying, but it's been, I don't know if he understood at the time just how true it would be, even in terms of people. And so tools like MUD are there essentially to automate functionality in terms of visibility. They don't add, MUD doesn't add any additional capability in terms of the data path. It's just a network management tool to say, hey, here's how the device should behave, and here's what's in it, and here's how you spot, right, that this device has this vulnerability. Now, does that mean everything needs remediation? If you see an IOC, do you have to, panic? You can't, right? First of all, there are so many vulnerabilities out there today, so many, right, that you have to prioritize in any sort of enterprise situation. This is one of the reasons that Cisco bought a company called Cisco Systems, which does that. You give it a list of CVEs that you're seeing in terms of indicators, and it tells you, yeah, this one you really have to worry about, this one probably not, right? And that's the role of Kenna. And then there's this question, right? How easy is all this, right? I came into this, and I think I was really, I'd have to say, naive to think that we could really produce high quality software bills of material in anything other than, relatively long periods of time, because it's bound to the length of our supply chain and our tooling. And I was lambasted this week by somebody saying, this stuff is easy. You can produce an SBOM in 3 minutes or 30 seconds or whatever. No, you might be able to produce an SBOM for a single package in some period of time like that. But for us at Cisco, or for medical device manufacturers, or for critical infrastructure providers in, say, hydroelectrics, or in the energy market in general, or in the automotive market, these are complex systems. And these complex systems have long supply chains, and these software bills of materials are hierarchical in that they follow supply container models. And that means, to me, that for me to produce a good SBOM, just as you said, Chris, my supplier has to produce a good SBOM, and that person's supplier has to produce a good SBOM. And then it all has to be cherry picked in terms of the functions of my supplier that I'm using, the software that I'm using, the software that I'm leaving on the table, on the cutting room floor, what compiler options I'm using. There are a raft of issues that that lead to whether a device will in fact be vulnerable, and in fact what software will be in the device. And I had no idea how difficult this would be initially. And today, the one thing I can say is that it's hard. I can't say how hard, even, because we haven't finished doing it.
Right.
So there's a lot of work to be done. And for any policymaker or consumer of this information to think that it's easy to generate, come talk to me. I'll give you the full, debrief in terms of the work that we're doing on it. But as a consumer of the information, and I want to be a consumer of the information, I certainly want it to be easier for manufacturers. So I want to mention one thing, which is that we're working in another forum called Global Platform. And Global Platform is looking to develop some practices for manufacturers that will make it easier to produce these things, such that they can be properly consumed in a way that the manufacturer can expect the consumer to see it. So if people want to join Global Platform and get involved, now's a very good time for that.
It's funny you mentioned that. Our mutual friend Tony Turner was out here on the boats with me yesterday, and one of the things we talked about is Global Platform. Yeah, he's half an hour here. It was so many things you were saying. I had to put this one in there. Welcome to my little friend Emergent Properties. To all the people who say this is simple. Everything is simple, one step at a time, right? However, everything in the real world has lots and lots and lots of steps, and I think this actually does play into my last point, right? So that Anthony, we can roll that last one. And I'll state my opinion because I'm a terrible interviewer, I guess, but I think all of these things are forcing us down a path where we have to automate transparency. And when I'm talking about diamond age here, I'm not saying, you understand. It doesn't mean you can see everything. That's not visibility. That's blindness. You need to see the things. I need to see the things that I need to see. And so many of the war stories, folks like you and I have, and, anybody, who understands what the heck we're talking about on a show like this, you look at it, and there was that one time where the heroic effort of the bare minimum team just at the last minute managed to get it done. And now we have more of anything. Pick a topic, right? Across decades, we could, pull them out of the hat, right? And when you get to the point that only, massive heroic efforts can make things work, and you're scaling more, there's a quantum change coming. We have to automate It has to actually be easy to make an S-bomb and to use one. Isn't today. So we need to automate that. And so again, I think we're moving more towards that. I think it applies to a lot of things, but cybersecurity and these sort of things, and inventory control and the cost of doing it and fixing it. How good do you think it gets? Are there unicorns? I think, or how far do you think this transparency thing goes?
I think there are unicorns, but I'm an optimist, and I do think there's a diamond age. But whether it occurs in my professional lifetime, I don't know. But I'll tell you a couple of things that I'm really, really positive on. The first is that processor architectures are still developing at quite a rapid rate. And we're learning how, for instance, to create trust zones in processors. And my hat's off, well, really it is, to companies like ARM and Intel and Apple, who's done some innovative work here too, in terms of how they can segment processes. And actually, your company is involved in that too, Chris. Cybeats, I should say. So that's important because as we learn how to segment processes, if one process gets corrupted, right, you can isolate yourself from the damage. Now, I say this in a, I would say a little bit of a state of innocence, in that I think it's still early days for that technology, but we are already laying the groundwork for what it means for a process to be healthy in these states. And so, for instance, there's work at the Internet Engineering Task Force around something called remote attestation. Is a device in a known good state? Are its binaries intact? Are the number of processes that we expect on it there? Are the file systems in the order that we would expect them? Are the communications the way we would expect them? Are the certificates intact? All of these, questions are sort of falling into place already, right? But there will be several generations of the technology. And I think that's great, because if the end system can do a better job of reporting its state to someone it trusts, right, then somebody can do something about that. And I think that's very positive. That's another form of transparency. SBOMs is one form of transparency. Vulnerability information is another form. I look for ways in which we can improve incrementally, and I see that happening not in a way that is really exponential or hyperbolic, but rather linear, right? We always think that technology moves quickly. First of all, for processor technology, that's really not true. It moves pretty linearly in terms of these sorts of new capabilities, with some backward steps along the way as people, develop side channel attacks or attacks on the trust zones themselves, which surely will happen, but will get better. Of course, the adversaries will get better too. That's their nature. And so the cat and mouse game will continue. But in my opinion, I think we have really good reason to be optimistic in the medium term, not even the long term. I think we'll hit that in the medium term. Look at this space again in 5 to 10 years. And I think you're going to see some pretty good incremental improvements in cooperation between devices, network systems, security systems. I think there's a lot to be positive about.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Right? There's, I've taken to saying that the 2020s is the last decade of cybersecurity. For two reasons. One is great way to drive people nuts, and it drives the conversation. I don't mean that we're not going to have adversaries and and so forth, but things could be better or they could be worse. And a lot of things now they're kind of worse. We can make those better, and we can make it difficult enough that it becomes a normal security practice and not a inventory, innovation and creation practice all the time. And there is not an infinite number of entire supply chain. In 2018, when I really got my head wrapped around supply chain, I was kind of offended, that we haven't done absolutely kind of nothing or at least deployed. But we've got. I think I can see the path. I think people like you can see the path forward well enough in that. And I don't think in 10 years and 20 years and 30 years we're going to be going, oh yeah, we never thought of threat intelligence. We never thought of supply chain. I don't think there's other major areas out there. I think most of it going forward is doing things we're starting to understand better. And we're really good at that. We're humans, curious little monkeys. So thank you so much. Thank you, number one, for everything. Thank you for, let me throw this one in. Thanks for recognizing Cybeats. So, people, see Cybeats as SBOM right now, but it came from Dimitri Raidman and the original team, looking at that, state of the actual deployed device. And I think that's something that's coming in the market at some point, because I think there's other visibility drives it more. If I can see everything except how the bloody thing is actually doing now that it's alive, why not do that too? So, right, it's there,
right?
And I know we're taking a lot of time, and I got to say thank you and goodbye at some point. But this is the fascinating thing, I've been advising Cybeats, I've been part of the team now for a while, and is it worth trying to explain to people that SBOM orchestration, SBOM studio stuff, and the agent stuff are actually related? It's all supply chain stuff. It really is. It's the stuff. Supply chain is before it was built, when it was built, when you got it, and in your use. And that's that last piece. We're I think is yet to be tied in, but you can see it from here, right?
Yeah, and I'm optimistic. That thread in which I got flamed out, where the person claimed, it was all easy. Well, no, it's not all easy today, but generating those SBOMs will be. Right. It may take a little while, but it will be easy. I'm really, really bullish on that. I want to call out one other technology that I think is going to help, which is my colleague, Ed Warnicki, has been working on an effort called Git bombs to help produce even cleaner SBOMs with a lot more richness to them. That's a good ways down the road in terms of work that has been done, and yet there's some work that will still need to be done there. And I encourage you to have Ed on this conversation.
Anthony, take a note. We'll definitely do that. Eliot,
thanks for having me.
You're welcome very much. Thanks for everything. We'll see you on the 17 working groups we share on a weekly basis right now, I think. So.
And thanks again. Have a great weekend.
You too, man. Cheers. Thanks, folks.
Bye-bye.